So the agenda is really deciding, everything related to subcontractors, because subcontractors for many of us are sort of a gap closure or something to be able to complete the delivery of an engagement. So there's really some discussions or decisions that need to be made regarding when do you need to have a subcontractor. If you do engage them, how do you factor that person into your project burn and your margin reporting? And then just in general, how do you factor the subcontractor into your current processes regarding resource management? And then a few little tips that I've encountered in working with a variety of customers over my career in how to manage subcontractor pools. So we'll dive right in with, how do you know when you need a subcontractor? So, the basic rule of thumb is you need a subcontractor when you are receiving more work than you can deliver, and you don't want to let your backlog grow faster than you can burn it, because then you may run into some customer satisfaction situations because people have to wait too long to get their project started. Or there might be a unique skill. Maybe you need somebody to translate your training material into Spanish because that's the recipient end user. And then finally, it's more staff augmentation is another big reason that you have subcontractors. Whole companies exist to provide this, and this would be, maybe you have a staff augmentation person for your QA or your documentation or your back office invoicing activity. So there are unique reasons why you need subcontractors, and each of these factor into the world of professional services. Now the biggest part of knowing when is how can you anticipate the need for it? How can you look ahead to say, I need to start researching that we need a subcontractor, instead of being a reactive situation where you're like, oh darn, we just signed this contract and we don't have anyone that can write a Spanish user guide. So that's something you want to try and get ahead of. So really using your PSA tool to manage or measure demand growth is one mechanism or one technique you can use to understand when you're expecting certain types of resources or when you're expecting a volume of resources that you don't have in-house. So the measures that you would put in place with your PSA tools would be like what work is coming in, what skill-based work is coming in, how much work is coming in, what kind of resources do I need, and typically that includes a type of skill, maybe an experience level. I need someone who knows OpenAir very well, or a job category. I need someone who can lead a project, so a project manager or project lead expertise. And then the other demand growth measure is what staff do I have? But really, it's not so much what staff do I have, it's really what do I have the right staff in place. So you could have enough people to do the math to say, if everyone hit their utilization targets, I have X number of hours of capacity. My backlog requires Y number of hours of capacity. It looks like with X I can cover Y. But all X is not the same, I guess you could say. You could actually have unique needs where you have the right staff, you have the staff, but they're not the right staff. So you need people that can write scripts, for example, and all you have are folks that are very good at doing training. So those two skill sets are not compatible. So you have to look at the type of staff that you have and if it's the right staff to match up with the work that's coming in or the work that's being forecasted, because that will drive a decision that you may need to look at subcontractors in the short term to fill that void. Now the demand versus capacity charts in your PSA are a good way to have more real-time information. So our previous webinars earlier this summer were about resource management and scheduling and utilization and forecasting utilization. So those translate directly into demand reports and being able to measure demand by categories. So maybe by job title or job code is a good one. By different types of skill categories is another one. And then being able to understand who you have on staff in those different groupings, and then what your demand is, being able to plan out those resources also by those same groupings, so you can simply just graph a bar chart like it's the example here. So you can see on this one, we have plenty of Java developers. We're right-sized for project management and DBA, but we are not in a good situation for technical writers. This would be a good case for either finding someone in-house that could pick it up, maybe using some of those Java developers, but maybe Java developers are more development-oriented, so they're not technical writers, so you could outsource that and find someone to do a staff augmentation or a subcontractor. Okay. So really it's the balance of the headcounts that you have and the utilization targets that people have against the demand of what's coming in. Now, there are the occasions like the example I gave about the special skill where you translate all of your materials into Spanish. There are occasional times in all professional services groups where the need for a subcontractor is not so much from a demand versus capacity mismatch. It's because you need a skill to deliver the work and you don't have that skill in-house. So this is certainly a temporary situation, and it would kind of come up as the skill gets scoped during the sales cycle. So when you're doing the sales cycle, this is where you want PS to be aware of what's going on in the sales cycle. When you identify the need that there's going to be a unique skill and that SOW or that proposal starts getting close to a verbal agreement or a signed work, you want to be able to start proactively looking for subcontractors that can fulfill that special skill. That actually drives, skill tracking starts driving the potential need for you to be able to build sort of a resume database that people can reference. Now, resume databases are something that have been talked about for many years. Can I create sort of types of resources, subcontractors that I've used in the past, and keep track of the skill sets that they delivered so that I would be able to look them up again if I needed to. And that's wonderful. But I do know that some companies are running into some GDPR, now data protection type challenges in storing that information. So what was once something that was kind of a nice, perfect solution for skill databases may run into some challenges if you are working in the European area and wanting to store skills. So I just want to throw that out there because obviously we're aware of it. And as long as the skill is more of a commodity that is requirement for us to be able to use that resource, it might be able to be captured. And when we open up the phone lines, if someone has had experience in handling this under a GDPR audit so far this year, I'd love to hear from it. Now, the third type of subcontractor, so we talked about sort of the hiring somebody because we have capacity challenges and demand is higher than we need, so we need to bring somebody on, or we have a special skill set. But the staff augmentation driver for subcontractors is really employ somebody as almost if they're an employee, like you're just paying them in whatever arrangement, a flat fee retainer or an hourly rate, but they're expected to be full-time on the project. So that staff augmentation may end up leading to permanent employment. So things like interns could be fall into this category. It could be somebody that you're bringing on a trial basis, and if everything works out, then you could bring them on full-time. So plenty of companies are out there to supply staff augmentation, and then those resources can turn around and be a full-time employee. But you want to be able to track them as a subcontractor in your PSAs, simply from a cost perspective in most cases. And speaking of cost, when you're dealing with a subcontractor, the cost tracking mechanisms really depend on how you're engaging with that subcontractor. If you are doing something like a temporary employee, a special skill employee, you may have like an hourly or daily rate that you agree upon. So that rate or cost per hour or per day would be something you would want to track in the PSA. And in some cases it could be a fixed price, like you just want somebody to do that Spanish translation. It's a flat fee, so that's more of a material cost almost in the system. The other is if you need to hire somebody with a special skill. Again, this is potentially a temporary item, but it could be something that you are just using this person ad hoc because you have a series of new activities that have the skill set while you train up your resource that you need to pay on an hourly or daily rate, or in some cases a fixed price if it's a deliverable based. There are plenty of partners of NetSuite that engage TopStep to be the OpenAir consultants as part of their joint projects while they're training up resources or having us mentor their resources along the way. So that would be an example of how a subcontractor would get hired in. And finally, staff augmentation. So I found that staff augmentation typically works best with a retainer model, not necessarily an hourly and daily rate, because you are expecting that person to be full-time. So if they have that 40-hour flex week type thing where one week it's 36 hours and the next week it's 44, if they're on a retainer, that kind of flex time can still be accommodated, very similar to what you're probably doing with employees. So retainer is more of a flat rate. You're expecting that person essentially to be full-time. You usually get some kind of price deal with that or cost break with that. But the staff augmentation is like a defined number of hours per week, and a retainer would give you a flat cost that you could incorporate into your system. Now, the cost tracking techniques based on whether it's hourly or daily, a retainer, or fixed price, your PSA solution should be able to handle the hourly and daily rates. Fixed price ones, the retainers tend to be more material or purchase-oriented type cost tracking. But when it comes to hourly and daily, you have to make sure that your PSA is set up in a way that you can track not only a cost of the resource, that subcontractor per hour, but the cost may vary based on which engagement they're being brought in at, because there may be different needs for skill sets. So someone who is brought in as a project manager could be at a higher rate than someone who's brought in as a technical writer, for example. So you want to be able to track the cost rates for each of the engagements based on how that's been negotiated with the vendor. And quite honestly, it may actually go down even further from a detail level. In fact, that you're engaging a vendor, you're getting subcontractors, and when they deliver database administration work, it's one rate, and when they're delivering QA effort, it's a different rate, and it's all part of the same project. So the PSA solution that you have in-house, most of them can handle, obviously all of them can handle a cost for the subcontractor, but check and see how you can break that down, and the lowest level of detail is what the system has to support, because in most cases you'll want to be able to measure accurate margin based on the fact that you've had the subcontractor spend in the system. And for many customers that are using a PSA, they want the cost to be traced back to not only the vendor themselves, but to the individual person who delivered the work on behalf of the vendor. A couple of reasons for that. One is you want to be able to reconcile things like the invoice from the vendor based on the worked hours from each of the subcontractors. But you also may want to display who delivered the work from a personal name perspective versus saying, I just employed, Accenture as part of mine. So you want the actual name of the person. So it's a communication outward to the client as well as the reconciliation inward. And along with reconciliation, audits come into play, quite honestly. Yeah. For many PSA systems, being able to trace things down to an individual subcontractor is not necessarily the same as having to purchase a user license for that PSA system. So there are plenty of ways to configure or use features in PSA tools to minimize user licenses for a resource that could be a very temporary resource, like your skill set ones or your temporary demand satisfaction type subcontractors. Now, the interesting thing about engaging subcontractors is you still want to be able to sort of schedule and know when work is being delivered. So From a project management perspective, you want to be able to know when the work is going to be done, and in many cases that timeline is being tied to or driven based on the resource scheduling that you're doing in the system. Now, for subcontractors outside of the staff augmentation exception, you can't really assume that those are 100% available 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week or 60 hours a week because you don't own those resources. All you've done is contracted with the vendor to be able to bring them on board. From a scheduling perspective, though, you can't really block your schedule. You can't really use your PSA tool or your resource scheduling tool to block around what that subcontractor's availability may be during a day. It's too much effort with very little benefit. But what you do need to do is you need to adjust your resource scheduling process so that you are able to tag user accounts or scheduled users as vendors so that you know the fact that you've scheduled somebody for 40 hours a week, you would have to get some kind of further confirmation or engagement of that vendor for them to say, yeah, we can actually deliver 40 that week, because you can't assume that they're available 40 hours. So the scheduling piece of your resource management process, when you're factoring in subcontractors, you do need to be aware that there's an extra step of validating whether that person is really available based on the timeline that you want for the hours that you need. Okay. To go along with impacts to your process, there are some PS metrics that I like to cover when I'm dealing with subcontractors, because I've had this conversation with a few customers in the past regarding how do you factor subcontractors into your standard metrics pile. From a forecasting perspective, a resource forecasting perspective, you do need to include the subcontractors that you're scheduling, but the scheduling of those subcontractors is just going to drive how many hours you're planning to deliver, so that you can compare the delivery hours based on the backlog of hours you have to see how fast you're going to burn off backlog based on that schedule of hours or cost. But you really shouldn't include the subcontractors in your capacity measure, like your forecast capacity, like who do I have on staff to be able to match the demand. If you include subcontractors in that forecast capacity, then you're potentially fooling yourself that you have access to the subcontractor full-time and you don't. So include them in the forecast of effort, but not in the forecast of capacity as you're looking at capacity versus demand, because that's an unknown at that point. Now, utilization is actually an actual thing, so you want to track and measure how the company is doing as far as utilization metrics. I've been asked this question many times whether whether subcontractors should be included or not included, and my standard response is if they're a staff augmentation person, then they're treated the same as an employee essentially. So yes, those can be included, and that would be a good factor into your utilization. If they're not a staff augmentation, then subcontractors tend to be a 100% utilized person. So if they're given 24 hours worth of work, all of those 24 hours should be billable. Therefore, they hit 100% billable utilization, but they only work 24 hours. So if you include the fact that all of their hours are billable at 100%, that could skew your utilization to look better than it is. And if you include them but assume they're a 40-hour a work week person, even though you didn't engage them 40 hours, it could skew your utilization downward, which wouldn't be a good ideal either. So I tend to shy away from having subcontractors included in utilization. It just skews the numbers one way or another depending on how you interpret the metric. But I do encourage having a subcontractor spend or a subcontractor hour trending measure so that you understand how many hours you're getting from subcontractors, ratio of subcontractor time versus employee time to see if you're doing a lot of out-of-pocket spend, and then doing some financial trends to say, if I used in-house resources, what would my margins have been versus the subcontractors that I brought in? Because once you start seeing bottom line numbers erode away on margin, that's when you start having to make the harder decision of, turning them into employees or hiring more people, because some subcontractors for companies are more expensive than in-house resources. So keep them, unless they're staff augmentation, keep them out of utilization. Definitely factor them into your forecast of effort and delivery. And then from a margin perspective, include them in your margin, of course, but also look at ways that you can run a comparative margin analysis of, if you used in-house, how much more money could the company have achieved. Now, a few tips for the subcontractor pool management. So the first one is the one I kind of mentioned at the beginning, is that if you can establish like a resume or a skill database for subcontractors that you've worked with over the years, that makes it easy for your project managers or your resource managers to find the subcontractors that you've used in the past. Ideally, also, they would have access to the cost information and the rate information that you had, and so therefore you're not having to reinvent the wheel. However, with GDPR, that may be a challenge nowadays, because you may be asking for information that is not allowed to be stored into your PSA. So you do have to check with your compliance officer on that. When you have a certain skill set need, ideally you're finding a vendor to have a continual partnership with that can supply or provide those resources, so that you could establish some kind of master agreement that would be an easy procurement process to continue to issue vendor POs to hire additional resources going forward. Okay. I do recommend, subcontractors are coming into your environment, so having someone for them to go to consistently is a good thing, I think. They could certainly talk to their project manager, but if the same person works with 10 different project managers and is told 10 different ways of what they had to do, that tends to be a little chaotic. So if you do have like a subcontractor or a vendor manager on site, or at least designate someone, they can also ensure that there's proper onboarding in place, and that we're making sure that resources have the right access in systems as they need to. Okay. Now, one caution I have to advise is it's very easy to get caught up in the automation or the standardization of setting data up in systems, especially when it comes to user administration in a PSA. But I do want to highlight that in many cases when you're hiring a subcontractor, you're hiring them to do one thing or maybe two things or work on one project. And if you follow your standard process for user setup in your PSA tool, you may inadvertently expose your entire customer list based on the permissions or the controls you have in place. So just keep that in mind when you're setting up subcontractors in your PSA tool. Don't assume that if you set them up as a time and expense user that that's restrictive enough, unless, of course, you're the administrator and you know it is. Double check that and make sure that you've got them locked down. They may drive a different role permission or a different data view specific to contractors, so they have a very limited view of the system. And you certainly want to protect your pricing and your discounting visibility. That gets a little sticky when you're hiring subcontractor project managers. But certainly you running an organization is definitely your intellectual property on how you're doing your methodology, so subcontractors should be brought in to do the work they're hired for and not necessarily do data mining in your system. So with that, we'll kind of summarize it, and then I'll open up the phone lines here shortly. Definitely subcontractors quite often are used to fill a need or a skill gap that you may have in your organization. When you bring them on board, make sure you have a way to track the costs that they're impacting on your projects, not only so that you can see what the margin is on the projects that you hire them for, but also to be able to do that sort of, what if measurement, side-by-side measurement, so you can see the impact of your bottom line as you have to fill demand areas with subcontractors. Okay. You have to consider subcontractors in your metrics tracking and your project and your system setup to make sure that they don't have too much access, and to see how they're impacting or not impacting your metrics to date. And if you can swing it, having a vendor manager or subcontractor manager would be great, because that way there's a consistent person for them to talk with at the end of the day.